Chapter 13. 10 days after his meeting with his con, Matt took his SUV to the airport to meet his sister and the rest of the group that had come with her. He waited in the cell phone lot for her call, then pulled up to the pickup lane and got out to help load the luggage. He was happy to see JV. He hugged her and let her put her bag in the truck. She'd have his head if he tried to take it from her. Next was Steve. Matt hugged him as well. Of course, there were Nick and Rebecca. They wouldn't have made the trip without them. He shook their hands and said hello, then added their bags to the cargo space while they got situated in the truck. He shook Bobby Carson's hand, loaded his bag and let him climb into the rear seat of the truck. He'd met Bobby several times and wasn't surprised by his presence. The one that did surprise him and last in line to load their things was Alex. She wasn't an enforcer and couldn't serve as security, so he hadn't expected her to come along. "Hey Matt, how you doing?" "Good, you?" He really didn't know what to say. He'd avoided her after the wedding, despite having been in town for nearly a week afterward. He wondered if she had noticed and what she was up to be standing in front of him now. "Not bad, but it's been a long day. I can't wait to get some sleep." She stretched her arms over her head and moved her shoulders back and forth before climbing into the truck with the others. Matt gave his head a slight shake, then headed for the driver's seat. He was in for a difficult few days. In the 40 minutes it took to reach his condo near downtown Denver, Matt came up with no better idea of how he would avoid Alex than he'd had when he spotted her at the airport. If he spent the next several days to a week in the same small space as her, he had no doubt that the attraction, the draw he felt for her, would grow. Possibly even become irresistible. There was no more time to waste. The time to make a decision had come. Was he willing to risk another relationship? The life of another woman tied to him? He still wasn't sure if he wanted to be responsible for another woman, another life. It had hurt so much to lose Connie. After showing everyone around his home, he took Nick and Rebecca to the guest room. "This is your room. I think you'll be most comfortable here." He looked at the heavily pregnant woman, noticing the lines of fatigue around her eyes. "Let me know if you need anything. I thought you might like to lay down for a little bit. I'm sure it's been a long day." "Thanks, Matt." She lightly touched his arm. "I could use a rest." She moved into the room and turned, taking in her surroundings as Nick followed her in, carrying their bags. "Thanks for letting us stay here, man. We could have gotten rooms, but I feel better here," Nick said as he passed his host. "No problem. En mi casa es su casa." With that he turned and left the couple. He continued down the short hall to the master bedroom with JV and Steve following him, and opened the door. "You guys get my room." "You don't have to give up your room, Matt." JV leaned against him and dropped her head against his shoulder. It was something she'd done a lot growing up, and it warmed his heart because she hadn't done it in a long, long time. "I do." He dropped his head so his cheek rested against the top of her head. "There are 2 mated couples here and 2 bedrooms. I can sleep in the living room with the rest of the single folks." "Are you sure?" "I am. I thought about giving you the other room and letting Nick and Rebecca have this one since it has an attached bathroom, but I remembered how the scent of another male on Connie about made me crazy. While this whole place smells like me, I don't sleep in the guest room and my scent won't be as strong there as it will in here. You 2 are related to me, plus, I stay at your place when I visit, so it won't be such a big deal to you." "You're probably right about the scent thing." Steve stepped past Matt and JV to take their bags in the room. He dropped them on the bed, then turned and put his hands on his hips. "What next?" "That's up to you guys. I took the week off, so I would be available as needed. I can mediate, I can chauffeur people around. Whatever you need." "Thanks again for doing this." JV stretched up on her toes and kissed his cheek before letting him go and moving into the room to stand in front of Steve. Wrapping her arms around his waist, she leaned in and rubbed her face against his chest. No problem. Bathroom's through that door. He motioned to the door on the far side of the room. I'll leave you to freshen up and go see how the others are doing. When he reached the living room, Matt found Bobby sitting in the recliner while Alex sat curled on one end of the sofa, her head laying on the arm. The soft snore coming from her made him smile. She probably wouldn't be happy to know she snored, or that he knew it. He thought it was endearing, and was careful not to wake her as he sat on the other end of the couch. Bobby had dropped his head back against the leather of the chair and was staring at the ceiling. Matt wondered how long he'd stay that way. They sat, each lost in their own thoughts for less than 10 minutes before JV came from the bedroom, with Steve only a moment behind. Why don't we go in the kitchen to talk? I'll make some coffee. Matt pushed himself to his feet and led the way. His sister and brother-in-law followed. He heard the whisper of shoes on the carpet and knew Nick was right behind them. A familiar soft creak of leather told him that Bobby was coming too. The light snore and soft rush of air let him know that Alex was still sleeping. Have a seat. He motioned to the dining table as he headed to start coffee. So what's our plan? He asked as he filled a kettle with water and put it on the stove to boil. We'll need to do something about dinner tonight and breakfast tomorrow, then it's all about the meeting. Nick took a seat and watched Matt as he moved around the small kitchen. Well, for food, we can either shop and cook or order something. I typically have something delivered, but we can go get it if you'd rather. Matt measured coffee into the pot. As for tomorrow, you told me to use my discretion in picking a place, so we're meeting at Washington Park. It's public, but it's also over 150 acres. We'll be able to have a degree of privacy in that we'll be in the open, and anyone can see what's going on. But we should be able to find a spot that's not busy. We won't have to watch every word that's said. Sounds good. Nick looked at the clock on the wall. Do we have time to have someone scout the park tonight? Before dark? Matt glanced at the clock. It's not even 5 yet, we've got plenty of time. The kettle started to whistle. He pulled it off the burner and slowly filled the coffee pot before setting it back on the back of the stove. We can pick up food while we're out. Who's going to scout and who's staying behind? I assume your mate will be resting for a bit yet? He put the lid on the pot and let it brew while he took mugs for everyone from the cabinet and lined them up on the counter. Nick's eyes went from one person to another around the small table before settling on Steve. You two go. He tilted his head toward JV. Steve started to protest, but Nick held one hand up. No, think about it. We're the only ones who know where we're staying. No one's going to find us here. Leave Bobby and Alex with us, we'll be fine. You're the best I've got and she's not far behind. He tipped his head in JV's direction again, as he spoke to his head of security. I want you both to scope out what we're looking at tomorrow. Figure out the best approach and how to keep my family safe. Matt stood watching the exchange. He glanced at the clock again, then slowly pushed down the plunger on the coffee press. When it reached the bottom, he poured 4 cups, set out the sugar bowl, and got a small container of cream from the fridge. Come get your cups and doctor them however you see fit. He set the nearly empty press aside and pulled a notepad from a drawer. What do we want to do for dinner? They got up and one by one picked up a mug, added sugar and cream to suit their tastes, and sat back down. If we're going to scope out the park and go shopping, it will be midnight before anything's ready. Why don't we get the groceries for breakfast, then pick up some kind of takeout for dinner? She looked around for approval. Sounds good to me. Bobby said. Whatever you decide is fine. Nick put in. You know what kind of things we like. I'll leave food decisions up to you. JV nodded. I can take care of it. Clan card, she looked at Nick for an answer. Yeah, of course. He sipped from his mug and looked at Matt. This is different. Good, but different. Matt smiled. He was glad they liked his coffee. He knew the French press he used at home didn't make coffee that tasted the same as the percolator they were used to, but it was what he had. He picked up the notepad he'd pulled out, grabbed a pen, and took them to his sister so she could make a list of the things they needed to pick up. You need anything else from me right now? I'd like to step outside and get a little air. He looked at Nick first, then at his brother-in-law. Steve shook his head, then looked at Nick. No, go ahead. If we need you, we'll call. Relieved to have the opportunity for a moment alone before time to leave, he stepped out the kitchen door into his small backyard. Near the back fence was a mountain alder. It wasn't huge but big enough to cast shade across most of the yard in the afternoons. He'd carefully trimmed and trained it, so that it had a single trunk bare for the first 6.5 feet before branching out to keep the summer heat out of the yard. Along 3 edges of the yard was a meandering fence, leaving a narrow flower bed filled with roses, peonies, and columbine. The only side that didn't have a flower bed was the one against the house. A porch about 8 feet wide didn't give a person room for much, but there was enough space for 2 wrought iron rockers with a matching table sitting between them. Under the alder and from flower bed to flower bed was a small patch of thick green grass. The entire yard didn't cover half the square footage of his condo, but it was his, and the bit of nature was what kept him sane in the bustle and busy of the city. Matt had kicked off his shoes beside the door before coming outside. Now, he sat in one of the rockers and slid off his socks. Stacking them on the table between the chairs, he stepped out in the yard. Thorns weren't a concern. He'd long ago removed them all the hard way, picking them up in his feet as he'd done exactly what he was doing now. Barefoot, he stepped out into the grass. Taking a deep breath, he closed his eyes and curled his toes in the soft grass while he let the familiar sense of the small yard wash over him. Focusing on his surroundings, he tried to clear his mind. He did his best to forget the worry of something happening to Rebecca tomorrow, the dull throb of his pull toward Alex, his worry about the future. Letting his head fall forward, he kept his eyes closed while he tucked his chin against his chest and stretched the tense muscles in his neck. After several moments, he picked up his head and stretched his arms over his head, feeling the bones in his spine pop and shift as his muscles let go of some of the stress he'd been harboring as he prepared for what was coming. We're ready when you are. His brother-in-law's voice pulled him back to the present. All right, I'll be right in. Rolling his neck, he dropped his arms, went back to the porch for his socks, then back inside.